Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome back to our 10th and final session of the Elire Strategy Summit. Again, my name is Jordan Future Burmeister. I'm our marketing manager at Elire, and a couple of quick items before we get started. As always, attendees have been placed on mute for the duration of the presentation. We are going to have a live Q&A at the end, so if you have any questions, feel free to submit them either in the chat to panelists or in the Q&A portal. We do also have a quick poll question right in the middle here that we'd love your participation with. And just some wrap-up reminders too. The Elire Strategy Summit Education Library is going to be available next week. That's going to have all of the recordings from the last 2 days of virtual learning. It is, however, going to be password protected. So keep an eye out early next week for your login to be able to access those recordings. And with this session, there is a change management toolkit that we're going to be sending out next week with this specific recording as well. So keep an eye out early next week for emails from that Strategy Summit at Elire email address. With that, I will hand it over to Stephen.
Thank you very much, Jordan. So good afternoon, everyone. Like Jordan said, this is our final topic for the Strategy Summit this year. And really, we wanted to end with talking about change management and how that can really lead to success. We have this sub-bullet, expanding and accelerating user adoption. But we're going to talk about change management for a couple of different scenarios, a couple of different project types, and really what you can do to build a strong strategy. So I'm going to introduce myself very quickly. We'll talk a little bit about what's the importance of change management, what's the big deal. We'll talk about kind of the Elire methodology and really why we took this approach. But really, we're going to talk about how you can just take those key pieces of the strategy and really build your own change management strategy that works for your organization. And then finally, like Jordan referenced, we do want to get you started off on the right foot. So with this presentation, you'll also get a couple of the tools that I reference, just included with the recording. So I'm sure you're all very familiar with Elire at this point, so I'll go through it very quickly. Who we are. We help our clients by partnering with them. And that's really the key goal for us is we want to work with clients as a partner and not just as staff augmentation, not just as someone who's in there for a project and leaves. And I think that it really shows with some of this change management methodology because it's very much a leave behind methodology. As you'll see from some of the strategy that we talk about, these are things that you should be adopting within your organization for all manner of projects. So Elire is very much focused on implementing software, upgrading it, optimizing it. But a lot of the themes and topics we're going to talk about today are just valuable for any type of organizational change or project that you're working on. So I think it's important to take this strategic viewpoint, even if you're not working on software projects. As far as myself, I'm a senior consultant with Elire. I'm in our strategy practice. And so I've had the opportunity to work on some very large projects, software upgrades and implementations that affect 20,000 plus users, and some very, very small projects. I'm thinking working with an accounts payable department that was a manager, a lead, and less than a dozen staff. And one of the things that really allows me to do is to speak about change management in principles as opposed to in specific deliverables. And so I think what you'll be able to do is take some of what we talk about today, take those principles that are valuable and really tailor a strategy for yourselves that works well. So let's talk about building that successful strategy. And one of the first things I want to talk about is some research that McKinsey Consulting actually put out just a couple of years ago. I read it, I think it was 5 or so years ago, and it's stuck with me since then. And at the time, they did some research with their clients that said 70% of change initiatives fail. 70%, which is crazy to me. If you had a software project or a software implementation and you knew that 70% of implementations failed, that company would be out of business immediately. And yet that's the case for a lot of these change initiatives. And sometimes change initiatives go along with the software project. Sometimes they're standalone initiatives. Sometimes they're organizational redesigns. But really that stat alone is pretty incredible. And it really speaks to the need to focus on change management as a standalone tool, as a standalone lever, if you will, when you're doing these other big projects. Two of the reasons that McKinsey cited for these projects not working or not being successful were employee resistance and a lack of management support. So those are going to be two refrains that you'll hear a couple times throughout this discussion. How do we address employee resistance? And then how do we build that manager support? So just keep that in the back of your mind as we kind of get into it. So again, Elire's approach has very much been on the side of software implementation and optimization projects. For years, we were just in the PeopleSoft space. Now we're across a bunch of different applications. But really the strategy here, how do you successfully adopt change? That applies to any kind of organizational change. So some of what we'll talk about, it's a little more tailored to software projects, but that's why I want to encourage you to pick out what's valuable and pick out what's useful. Training and change management kind of overall is really key in our perspective to maximizing the value of your software investment. You can spend thousands or millions of dollars on a new piece of software, and if your users don't know how to use it, or if your staff aren't comfortable using it, or if your leaders don't know how to get meaningful reports or data out of it, it's money not well spent. Similarly, you want to minimize your business disruption. Again, from an implementation project perspective, go live weekend is, the nail biter. Everybody's worried about if it's going to work. Everybody's worried about, can we go live? That disruption, there's a reason it happens on a weekend, but that disruption can really be eased by building a strong change and training strategy. So again, Elire's approach is always to be flexible. We take kind of the best from a bunch of different change management approaches that are out there. So, we take a little bit from McKinsey. We take a little bit from ADKAR. We look at the adult learning model when we talk about delivering training. So I would encourage all of you to do the same thing. Be flexible, find the tools that work, and really draw on experts across the field. So we'll talk about our approach, but again, I'd encourage you to tailor it to really suit your organization. And so our approach is really 6 steps. We start with plan and discover. We move into a design phase. We build all of our various materials. We deliver those materials, whether that's communications, training materials, et cetera. Evaluating and assessing the success is definitely a big thing. So that's another refrain you'll hear from me. And then finally, support. It's easy to think of a change initiative as being a one and done. We're going to reorg and then everything will be better. But that's naive, honestly. You're going to need ongoing support. Staff turnover happens. The business environment changes. Things are constantly changing, and so your strategy for approaching that change needs to continue to exist and continue to support your staff. So let's start with planning and discovery. And this is actually one of the longer phases for us. We're very much about taking that strategic approach, thinking very carefully and thoughtfully about what are we doing before we actually execute. So one of the first things we like to do is identify our resources. You should be asking yourselves, do we have an organizational change management team? Do we have specific resources that are knowledgeable in this area? Do you have a corporate communications team? Do you have an enterprise learning management, ELM, or learning management system, an LMS? Do you have that infrastructure already in place from both a people perspective and like a software tools perspective? It's definitely critical to make sure that you're using the resources that you do have. And if you don't have these resources internally, then it's going to be important that you assign those types of roles to your project team members. Make sure you have someone who's responsible for change in communications. The next thing that we like to do after we have kind of a sense of what our resources are is conduct a listening tour or a survey. And it doesn't have to be anything fancy. SurveyMonkey works great in a lot of cases. It's Easy, it's approachable, gets you good responses, gets you good metrics. But really what you're trying to do is understand a couple of things. You want to know what's a preferred communication method. Do people want to be communicated with via email? Do they want a manager notification? Do they want an executive message? What's going to be the best way for them to hear and absorb what you're about to tell them? Similarly, you can start to understand preferred training modalities. Some people really learn better by getting hands-on. Some people learn better by reading something, taking some time to absorb it, asking questions later, but they need a little less hands-on work. So taking this listening tour or survey to understand your audience, definitely critical so that you can start to deliver communications and trainings that really works for them. And the third thing is something that I don't think enough people do, but defining your baseline metrics. So defining readiness for change is, I think, a critical thing. And what I mean by that is, are your organizations even ready to start hearing about what you're talking about? Are they completely underwater? Have they already heard about this new software upgrade project? Are they excited about it? Do they have questions about it? If you have an organization that's full of 20-year veterans who are very much set in their ways, they're going to need a lot more support, a lot more messaging, and a lot more training than a very agile team, that's expecting change. So defining that baseline readiness and then following up on that over the lifespan of your project is definitely going to be one of the tools that you can use to ensure that your change activity is successful. Similar to identifying your resources from an infrastructure or a team's perspective, you definitely want to look at what you already have from a training, job aid, communication perspective. So that might be existing courses that are in your LMS. That might be job aids or desk procedures or quick reference guides that your various departments already have. Building a quick inventory of what you have is definitely a great place to start so you don't have to reinvent the wheel. And then finally, last but certainly not least, once we have that sense of what the resources are, what some of the background communication methods or culture is, what already exists, that's when we really want to kick off a change impact assessment. So let's look at that in a little more detail. So a change impact assessment shows how the future state is going to impact your organization from a couple different perspectives. So right here, we call out people and system. I would argue you could also look at change to the process itself. If you're changing the way that transactions are passed around your organization. And maybe you're not undertaking a software project, so there's not a system change. Well, then ignore that and just talk about people and process. Again, be flexible with how you're taking this approach. But the idea of the change impact assessment is to say, what's the current state? What's the future state? What's the difference? And then who's affected by it? So let's take a quick look. So again, this is from like a PeopleSoft upgrade project type, a big project, thousands of end users. And so really we want to answer a couple questions. We want to answer what's changing, what was the current state, what's the future state, what's the change, how much is it changing, because that's our impact score, and then who is it affecting? Is it, as you can see in the middle of the screen, is it employee self-service where it's affecting 20,000 people, or is it affecting the payroll department of 10 people? Because that's really going to impact the modalities that you're using to kind of share your messages, to share your training. So again, for Elire, because we have this kind of software-centric approach, we have a couple of tools that we've built in-house to identify like customizations within your application. PeopleSoft does a good job of posting what they call the cumulative feature overview. So you know what kind of new features are out there. So a net new feature is, of course, going to be a change. And so you can kind of do that with other software products as well, where you can gauge, at least to start off, a sense of what's going to be different. For other projects, old reliable is always workshopping. get together with the department, discuss the change that's there, discuss their current state, talk about what the future state looks like, and then start to estimate out, how many users there are, how big of a change is that really happening. So again, as you can see, we put it in a matrix, right? It's the easiest way to track it. It's the easiest way to summarize it. So this is what's changing, at kind of a process level. We've got our score, how impactful is this change? And then we've got our populations. And again, in this case, we found it valuable to look at heavy users and light users. In your case, it may just be one type of user, but the process might be different depending on department. So really be flexible with your approach. But again, the idea is here, what's changing, what's the size of that change, who's impacted. That applies kind of regardless of what type of project you're looking at. So one thing that we do on occasion, especially with like a software implementation or upgrade, is a job impact assessment, kind of a separate or a subset of the change impact assessment. So instead of tracking by application module, tracking by department, we kind of take that same data but pivot it by job role to say, hey, if you're an accounting manager, things are going to look very different specifically because you're an accounting manager. And it's sometimes helpful to kind of take that step back to pivot your data to look at the people behind the scenes who are going to be involved or affected, because then you can take the steps to really address that change on a more personal level. The other thing to look at is roles that have a high turnover. So again, from a job perspective, if you have a job that has 10% turnover year over year, it's one thing to provide training or support as part of your project. Excuse me. But you will also need to provide support to new hires, because inevitably by this time next year, you're going to have 10% of your population's new. So it's helpful upfront, because you're doing this assessment of your various departments, the jobs involved, what's changing. It's helpful to use this as a lever to get that data, if you will, about individual jobs, so that you can be prepared for that long-term strategy, for that support item that we saw early on. So let's think about where we are, right? We've done our listening tour. We have a baseline metric for these departments are ready to go. These departments are going to need some extra support. We've noted communication preferences. How do people adopt training? How do people want to hear these messages? We've looked at some of these existing materials. We know, hey, we have a great LMS system. There's good content in there. We just need to add to it, or we just need to tweak it. Or maybe you're starting from scratch and you need to build it all. And then you've done your change impact assessment. You've identified the who, the what, and the how much. So now that you have all of your background information, the last step here is really to develop your strategy for this project, for whatever this initiative is. So the change management strategy is about taking that background information and then building an approach. And again, we use these this three-pronged approach. You can use whichever ones work for your organization. We always like to start with a communication approach. So, are we going to be doing executive messages? Are we going to be sending out newsletters? Are we going to have managers share updates with their staff in weekly team meetings? And this is not the point where we need to have everything planned out completely down to the date. This is just the point where we say, we know what the infrastructure is, and we want to use these tools as part of our project. If there's a key project date, sure, we need to know that, but really we're looking at the modality. Similar with the change approach. So Elire likes to take this approach of using what we call a change champion, which could be a manager or even just a lead within a department, but somebody who has a lot of respect of their peers. The idea with a change champion, if you can identify them up front, if you're going to use them, is that they can really drive behavior on an individual department level. Sometimes it's nice or helpful to have an outside project team come in and shake things up. And sometimes it's nice to have somebody who's already well established within the department say, yep, I'm behind this, and kind of help build internal support. The other thing that you can identify is what are going to be your metrics for success. So you already have a baseline readiness for change, but how do you know if your change was successful? That should be defined upfront in this plan and discover phase. And then finally, you should have an approach in mind at this point for your training. Have you identified if you have the infrastructure? Are you going to use a learning management system? How are you going to address what we call the 5 moments of need? And I'll talk about those in just a moment. But really, this is where you take all that background information and you summarize it to say, okay, this is the approach we're going to take, to communicate, to influence behavior, and then to get people trained. So this is just kind of a summary of that whole idea. Take your background information and then come up with your approach, for each of these different directions. So the last thing I want to talk about, because I think I just referenced it, is the 5 moments of need. So we like to use this idea as kind of a checkpoint. When you're nearing the end of your plan and discover phase, to really say, all right, am I covering all my bases? So part of the, actually a couple of change management methodologies use a similar type of approach, but part of it is really to say, what are the different times that people will need support when a change happens? So we think about it like this: when you learn something new, there's a project going on that's going to impact you. When you need to learn more about it. Okay, there's a project and it's impacting your department in this way. The third, applying it. Do you, not just know that there's going to be changes to how you process transactions, but, what's that actually going to look like? How do you actually enter a new transaction in the new application? How do you go through this new policy? How do you address this new procedure? When things go wrong, you need to have support in place for answering questions. It's not enough to just say, all right, here's your training and good luck. Having that short-term help or that long-term help, and identify what's going to be your approach there, that's definitely critical. And then finally, when things change. So you want to have a change management methodology or a strategy that is forward-looking and expecting things to change in the future. So as you'll notice, these aren't just training. It's kind of a mix of both communications, training. You could have change champions in here as well. But really, it's a checkpoint. It's a checkpoint to say, am I covering all of my bases so that with this change that we're about to undertake, I've communicated up front so everybody's aware of it. We have some simple training available. To apply it, maybe that's where you get a manager or a change champion involved. When things go wrong, that might be a project team, that might be help desk. So again, this is just to make sure that the change is looked at holistically across all of your different approaches for delivering your different messages. So that leads us to the poll question, which is really just, what kind of communication methods does your organization use? So I think we'll give it just a minute here.
And this is a select all that applies. So please select all choices relevant to your organization. Just a reminder too, while we're waiting on responses, we are going to have that Q&A at the end. So please submit any questions through the chat to panelists or that Q&A function at the bottom. Give it about 10 more seconds, then we'll close it out. Alrighty here, so kind of across the board, but it does look like predominantly executive messages, videos, or updates, as well as newsletters or weekly emails.
And that's really what I like to see, because I think a lot of people know and recognize that getting information, getting communication in this variety of methods definitely hits different groups differently. Um, it's helpful to have background support. We talked about it right up front where, again, McKinsey said that one of the reasons a lot of these efforts fail is because there's not that executive buy-in. So if during your plan and discover phase, you can build, the sponsorship at the executive level, you can get those people to deliver your messages. That's going to be key to finding success with a lot of these things. Okay, so let's talk about design. So we've done our planning. We've understood our infrastructure, we've understood the change, we've decided on an approach. So based on the communication approach that you've decided on and your change impact assessment, then you can start to define one of your first real deliverables, which is going to be a communication matrix. And the communication matrix is all about making sure that you're sending the right message to the right group or person at the right time. And I mean, you can use these existing meetings, you can use newsletters, forums, the executive messages. You really want to leverage all of those things in your various ways to send that message to each individual group. So one thing we like to do is build the messages into a calendar. So you have your overarching global messages. Hey, this project's kicking off. You want that one to be a communication directly from an executive. Then maybe you want department specific messages, and that'll be, you'll communicate with the managers of those departments, and then the managers will tell their staff. Then you want, line of business messages. And that's just going to be, an email to everybody in that line of business. Use those different messaging modalities to really match your messaging to these various milestones on your project calendar. I think you can see there, again, ensuring that you have leaders buying in, leading by example, sharing the messages themselves. It's absolutely critical for the success of any kind of change initiative. And another thing is really including change champions. So that could, again, it could be a manager, it could just be a trusted person within each department, because that really does help to say, hey, the project team's saying this, but also these people that I respect, these people that are very knowledgeable and trustworthy within my organization, they're saying the same thing. That's really going to help build some of that support from an internal perspective. So one of the other things I wanted to call out here with the communication matrix is that you can even turn it from a calendar of communications into a tracking tool. You can start to say, okay, we want this global email sent out by such and such date. Do we have it started? Has anybody drafted copy? Do we need an approval for this? Does it have to go by the corporate communications team? So you can really take the different messages, build it into a calendar, and then even make it into kind of its own tracking tool, which I found very helpful. One thing to bear in mind is that you want communication to be frequent. It's got to start at mobilization and really continue even beyond go live to that support phase. If you just communicate, hey, something's changed, and then you go silent, it's not going to be a successful project. So that's kind of the communication side. On the training side, again, based on the results of your change impact assessment and what you've decided on for your training approach, that's when you can start to put together another one of these deliverables, which is a training curriculum, which, again, this isn't the course content itself. It's really just what kind of classes are we going to do? What kind of job aids do we need to create? What general high-level content do we need to include in it? This is also where you can start to evaluate your logistics. So that you have an LMS platform from the plan and discover phase. Well, maybe they only do updates once a month. So now you need to start planning your logistics about feeding courses and feeding content to your LMS. Maybe you need to train your accounting team. So you need to start looking at the accounting calendars and make sure that you avoid month-end close. But the curriculum is really in this design phase. This is the time to do it. Some other things that you can do in this design phase, you can start looking at branding. If you have templates, email templates, job aid templates, things like that. Definitely critical to make sure that it's consistent and professional. You can start building out prototypes if you don't have anything pre-built. Starting the conversation early about a training environment. Again, we come from a very software-centric perspective, but staging data, getting the environment, getting the LMS set up, giving people an environment to practice in, definitely critical. A lot of adults just learn better hands-on as opposed to through lecturing or teaching. And this is also the time to start looking at your help desk materials. So again, that's that future facing that we're looking at, the support phase. After the project's over, after this is done, who's going to man the help desk? The project team won't be here to answer all of the questions. So let's get the help desk ready. Let's make sure that they have not just training on answering questions in the short term, but that they have great materials for the long term. So after that's wrapped, then we get into really development, which is just, kind of heads down, creating your pieces of content. Just a quick reminder, it's always helpful to have a QA process. You want to build your content and you definitely want other eyes on. So for us, again, because we're coming in as an outside partner, we do an internal quality review and a client quality review. For yourselves, if you have an internal change management team, it can be helpful to get just different sets of eyes on each piece of content, or even promote that up to project leaders. So if you have a project sponsor, they don't necessarily need to see everything, but let them see, a couple examples, get some eyes on, get their feedback. So again, it's not just about the training. This is all of the individual pieces of content. That might be your emails. What's the message you're trying to send based on your communications matrix? It's when you can write your posts on the forum. It's when you can actually record the videos or messages from your executives. It is where you can build up your training courses or tweak the ones that you have. And one thing that I would reference is really just this idea of bringing in resources to help develop training materials. It's something from a consulting point of view, like you bring in a technical or a functional consultant because you know that they have knowledge of the software in that area. The exact same principle is true for a lot of change management and training. A good instructional designer is worth their weight in gold. They can make content that is meaningful, is attractive, and really still sends the correct message, gets the right information to the user, but a way that the user is going to more easily adopt it. And again, from a project perspective, one thing we always like to do in this develop phase is make sure that we are ready for user acceptance testing. So UAT is kind of like our dry run. It lets us test a lot of these training materials. If you have a small group of UAT testers, you can get their feedback, you can improve it, you can say, did we miss anything? Where are the gaps? And then when you actually go live, then you can deliver that same training that's now been through an internal review, a project team review, and actually field tested. Now it goes out to your broader audience. So the next step after you've built it, right? You've planned it out, you've designed it, you've actually written copy, you've gotten your training materials created. Now it's time to deliver it, right? You should have your calendar in place based on your communications matrix. So you should be able to say, all right, we have this project milestone coming up. A week before this project milestone, we need to send the teaser. So let's get that teaser email. The day before that project milestone, that's when we want a manager communication. So let's make sure that's on the team meeting agenda. And the day of the milestone, that's when we want the executive to say, hey, everyone, congratulations. So really using that matrix to deliver each piece of content as it is necessary. Similarly, you're going to be using your training material or your training curriculum to actually deliver your training. Again, you want to base it on your project milestones, but you want to say, you do want to find that balance between when people are going to actually be able to use the training and when you're delivering the training. So if you're not going live for 2 months, delivering training, hosting webinars, doing instructor-led courses, it's not going to be as impactful as it would be if you're able to deliver the training, they're able to get hands-on practice, and then execute right away. One of the things I think we touched on a little bit in the design phase is this idea of using your learning management system, delivering it with an instructor, having instructor-led training, or just delivering, like a one sheet or a job aid to your staff. That's something that I think is critical to approach, that you take the correct approach for each individual type of training. And really the idea there is if you have people who need to get hands-on early, building out a space for them to do so, building out that training environment, getting them in the LMS early, that's going to be extra impactful later on. So one of the things I wanted to look at quickly, this is just kind of what like a simple learning management solution can look like. And really, I think it shows the value of, building training to meet your target's needs. Putting together professional training that meets the requirements is absolutely critical to getting people to buy in. Again, kind of the adult learning model looks at knowledge, motivation, and skills as kind of the three big areas. So knowledge is one thing, what's changing, how do I do it? But if you'll look, training like this really does lend itself toward skill. There's a link embedded so you can go and actually try to access this demo environment. You can set up your user and everything. So really combining those three things, not just how to do something, but giving people the ability to practice, and then giving them the motivation, what's in it for me? Bringing all three of those pillars together is really critical for making your training effective. Even something like a simple one sheet here, you want to be able to link videos. You want people to say, all right, well, I have Outlook open. Let me go practice using a sweep. It's really just critical, again, to get all three of those pieces, the knowledge of how to do it, the practice, whether it's embedded links, whether it's opening up your own Outlook app, whatever, and then the motivation, why is this valuable? How is this worthwhile? What's in it for me? Bringing those three things together is really going to be critical for successful adoption at the end of the day. So the last, or almost the last thing that I think is critical when you're building a change management strategy is this idea of metrics or assessment. It's one thing to deliver a bunch of great communications. It's another to build some slick training courses. But if you didn't measure your baseline readiness for change, if you're not measuring how many people are taking the classes in the first place, if you're not measuring, are people actually adopting this new behavior, are the change champions being successful at enforcing it, then you're not going to know if you're successful or not. So one of the things that I think we really need to focus on is establishing upfront, what are my metrics for success? Not only are people ready, but how do I know that they've actually adopted this change? For training, you can do things like an evaluation. If you've done instructor-led training, you can ask the attendees to fill out a survey. If you have a learning management system, you can check course completion. You can check percentages if you have tests set up. Did people score 100% on every evaluation? Those are the kinds of things that you definitely need to put in place, because otherwise, what's the point? If you're just going to be spending all of this time and all of this effort building these messages, getting executive buy-in, building these courses, and then they sit out on a shared drive somewhere, you've kind of failed in your change management project. So again, this idea of doing assessments, thinking about them early, and really building it into the overall methodology or your overall strategy is critical. So finally, let's talk about support. So I've referenced this a couple times, but really your strategy should include kind of this evergreen or post-project strategy as well. What's going to be your plan for maintaining content? From our perspective, again, if the software is changing every couple of weeks or every couple of months, how do we make sure that our training materials aren't immediately out of date? You need to have a plan for that. If there's a new hire or if there's turnover, for example, how are you going to make sure that you're not relying too much on this project knowledge, and instead you have a good body of knowledge ready for a fresh green person who can readily adopt this change and readily adopt whatever the new process is, whatever the application is, whatever it might be. Do you have a communication strategy for saying, hey, everyone, the software is continuing to change, be aware of it. This is a big change. We're going to need some follow-up training. Do you have ownership of the ongoing process, or are you thinking about it like a one and done? We did our upgrade and now the change is over. Because that's really not a way to be successful. Really, you're just digging yourself in a hole as you get more and more turnover. And I mean, the stats are right there. The BLS says that turnover can be anywhere from 12 to 15%, which means if you have 10,000 employees, that's 1,500 people that weren't part of the project, that didn't get any communication, that have no idea outside of their onboarding, what was happening. So building this in both from a project perspective as well as an ongoing perspective is absolutely critical. The other thing to bear in mind is a help desk. So this idea of a help desk, I talked about it a little earlier, but it can be really useful both when you're going live with a project as well as after the fact. If you support your help desk with quality materials, with a good process, with strong ownership and leadership, then they can really step in and help support whatever the ongoing training needs are. Any additional changes that are happening, if you've looped the help desk in, that can be your first line of defense. And so I think it's important to recognize that as a leave behind. After your change project is over, are there other people who have adopted and internalized that change that are then advocates for it? So again, let's think about this from the highest level. We want to start thoughtfully. We want to start carefully. We want to say, what's the impact? What were my tools? What was my infrastructure? What's the baseline readiness for change? Get that survey out there. What learning do we already have? Be careful about what you're doing. Set up a strong, thoughtful approach. And that's going to really set you up for success over the rest of your project. Second, design. Build out that training curriculum. Make sure that you're addressing each of those 5 moments of need. Build out your communication matrix. Build out your calendar. Set a structure up. When you're developing, build in that QA approval process. Make sure you're not the only one who sees your communications or your materials. As you're delivering, take advantage of tools like a learning management system. Take advantage of the managers that are within each department. Take advantage of those change champions. Measure your metrics, honestly, while you're delivering. You want to understand what was the baseline up front. You want to get consistent feedback as you're delivering these items, and then you can do kind of a project evaluation a little bit later. But again, evaluate, identify what it means to be successful from a change perspective, measure that, and then compare it to what you thought in the first place. Report on that. There's nothing to really force success and kind of force the issue like public reporting. If you have a department that's way behind on completing their required training, just start publishing training numbers. There's nothing like a little social pressure to really push a change and force adoption. And then finally, with support, make sure you have that evergreen strategy, that you're thinking about it up front, not just how am I going to get through this project, but how am I going to make this project successful and everything that comes after this project a continued success. So let's talk about the Change Management Toolkit. And I see we've got about 12 or 15 minutes left here for questions and things like that too. And again, I just want to reiterate my message about building a strong strategy. You don't have to adopt a Elire strategy by any means. We certainly have built from the best that's out there. And I would encourage all of you too as well. The real takeaway is to be thoughtful, to think about communication, to think about training, and to think about behavior, and really to measure what's going to make you successful. So in order to support that, there are two things that we wanted to send with you. One is a basic change impact assessment matrix. So to help you frame out what's changing. You can gather all of that infrastructure information, who your change management resources are. That's going to depend on your organization. But really, it's helpful to have a nice little structure around that change impact assessment to say, what's the change, who's impacted, how big is it? And then the follow-up is the communication matrix. Again, that turns into your calendar. It turns into your tracking tool. Really critical for any change project, building out that communication matrix. Define your modalities, look at your project timeline, and really marry those two things up, so you know what communications you're delivering when, what's the modality, what's the audience. So the two key parts of this kind of approach, you'll get to take with you. So that does lead into Q&A.
And we'll give everyone just a minute here in case there's any questions that come in. Otherwise, a couple of quick reminders while we leave that Q&A open. Again, those change management templates, that toolkit that Stephen just mentioned, we will send out next week along with the recording of this presentation. There will also be the full Elire Strategy Summit education library that'll be available next week as well. Again, that is password protected, so make sure to keep an eye out for, in your email for that password. And lastly, too, as we kind of wrap up, if you're looking for additional educational opportunities, we do have monthly webinars as well as weekly newsletters that go out, and tons of great content available on the Elire blog. It does look like we have a question that came in here in the chat. So what's the best approach to take when executive buy-in is lacking?
Well, that's definitely a hard situation. And I think it depends on how broad your project is. If you have a project that's going to affect a lot of your enterprise and you don't have executive buy-in, I think you need to think very seriously about the project in general. If you're kind of forced to go ahead anyway, if you need to undertake that project and you can't get executive buy-in, I think the best thing that you can do is really shore up all of those other pieces of your communication approach. Even if you don't have the executive sending messages, making sure that you as a project team are addressing those 5 moments of need can be not just as impactful, but it can be a good way to augment what you're doing or kind of cover for the executives. If you're being thoughtful, if you're being careful, if you have materials and communications and an approach in place to deal with those 5 moments of need, you can start to bridge the gap that maybe the executives create or the lack of executives create. So it's really about going back to basics and making sure that you're addressing each of those things. Because from an individual level, even if the executives aren't behind the project or the change, if you as an end user who are going to be affected by it still have all of those day-to-day resources in place, that's still going to be very supportive. If you have a very communicative project team, you're still going to feel very supported. If you still have, the training, you have the regular communications, and you have the tools, you as an end user, even if there's not the executive buy-in or messaging, you're still going to feel, well, I have the tools at my disposal here.
And it looks like another one came in through the Q&A. So does this approach work for a non-technology project, such as an organizational change?
Yeah, I think that's what I tried to be clear about up front, is a lot of our approach is focused on software projects, but really the principles are what we want to take away. Looking at the change impact, it doesn't have to start with software release notes. Your change impact can start with workshops of, what's this new policy going to be? What's the new procedure going to be? What's the new org structure going to be? And how might that affect these individual people? So the approach is still there. You just have to be a little more creative about how you're identifying what the change is. But in terms of communication, training, getting the behavior change by using your change champions and your managers all up and down the org tree, that's absolutely still going to be supportive. It's just that in the beginning, when you're looking at the change impact, that's going to be a little harder to do because it's going to be a little more subjective, identifying what that change impact is, workshopping, as opposed to doing it, because you have release notes to work off of.
Thank you, Stephen. And it doesn't look like we have any other questions in here. So with that, we're going to go ahead and wrap up our first ever Elire Strategy Summit. One additional item to add is we will have a conference feedback form that's going to be going out to all attendees along with the recording. So if you have any feedback on what types of new sessions you'd like to see on our fabulous presenters, we would love to hear from you and incorporate that into our next virtual conference. I want to thank everyone for their time. Make sure to follow us on social media and enjoy the rest of your week.